Synvariance, then, this term, it's a queering or a defamiliarizing of both syntax and invariance, which is to say, a reorientation of both. Syntax generally constitutes the logical stringing together of words in order to make sense. Invariance generally constitutes a principle of constancy or universality, that which does not vary. These two concepts I bring together here because they both constitute certain spatiotemporal presuppositions. Syntax generally requires some kind of linearity, while invariance generally requires some kind of stasis. And both concepts were fundamental to structuralism in its origin and development. One of the ways that structuralism historically informs the kinds of disciplinary diffractions that we've seen being discussed in this conference is through a determined attempt to link the humanities and the sciences, which is encapsulated in its originary aim to create a science of language through the identification of a synchronic system containing linguistic invariance. And that link is not just methodological, according to structuralist linguist Roman Jakobson. In his writings, at various points, he hints at links between Ferdinand de Saussure's course in general linguistics and Einstein's general theory of relativity, both published around the same time. But Jakobson's project is sharply different from Saussure's in terms of the roles of stasis and succession in the thinking of linguistic spatiotemporality. And to put it very quickly, Jakobson aims for a critique of both of those things, stasis and succession. Should be going on to my next slide now, if it works. Yes. So let's go through an example of synvariance. Pareidolia, to see patterns where seemingly they are not. It is impossible for me to read the word pareidolia without thinking of a proliferation of doilies, the most kitsch of early 20th century kitchen fripperies, decorative paper circles with intricate patterns of holes cut out of them, like obverse paper snowflakes, but actually could operate as the transfers for dustings of icing sugar snow to form further patterns on cakes. Patterns upon patterns. My grandmother would place a doily over her Victoria sponges before shaking icing sugar over them, so there would be fractal dustings of sugar patterned across the top. My cognitive linking of the word pareidolia to the object doily is an example that appears to contradict Saussure's conception of the non-motivatedness of the signifier-signified relation, i.e. the relation between the word pareidolia and the concept that it denotes as an arbitrary one, and rather affirms Jakobson's poetic function, which, in his words, projects the principle of equivalence from the axis of selection into the axis of combination. The equivalence or sameness that is generally perceived on the vertical axis of selection, consisting of metaphorically and paradigmatically arranged lexical elements with common elements, is projected into the axis of combination, consisting of metaphorically and paradigmatically arranged lexical elements with differing elements, so that there are shared elements across the syntagm. The axes themselves are reconfigured. We generally create meaning through combinations of differential linguistic elements rather than shared metaphorical ones, but Jakobson's poetic function reconfigures this. So when I link pareidolia with doily, I create meaning through an alternative route. Just, my clicker is quite slow to react. I hope you can see that quite small writing there. We have some axes there. So what this means is that within Jakobson's poetic function, the relationship between language, space, and time has fundamentally changed. The letters D-O-L-I or D-O-I-L in the respective words are in fact combined with my associations of their patternedness to produce a cognitive link, an analogy. Pareidolia for me is a doily, multifariously. The almost fractal patterns cut into the circles of paper are replicated in the concept, which happens to denote the perception of patterns which apparently are not there, even though the patterns of the letters D-O-L-I and D-O-I-L form the beginning of a sequence based on another logic, that of letter ordering. So why is all of this relevant? I've linked these words through their shared patterns of letters, sound, and a common denotative feature of patterning. They are therefore linked semantically as well as sonically, although this is incidental. Are we able to make any sense of this then? The shift here is to do with the axes. Sonic linkages are due to resemblance of sound rather than difference, which is why they are paradigmatic and correspond to the vertical axis of combination. Our system of reason is forever linked to the other axis, the horizontal axis of differential selection. The differentiation between the syntagmatic and the paradigmatic axes of language was developed considerably by Jakobson and later set further in motion by others. Throughout his career, Jakobson pointed out the need to consider both invariance and variation in both axes. Everything outside of the synchronic snapshot or slice for Saussure is external to language, whereas for Jakobson, this exteriority is within the phenomena that is language. And that idea of exteriority within, or the stranger within, is something which we heard in Karen Barad's paper, for example. Okay. Let's turn to another example. Just trying to get my clicker to click. Oh, there we go. So I'll read that quote if it's too small. In terms of syntax and rhythm, Gertrude Stein's famous lecture.
If you're having problems with the clicker, then if you just ask Brian to move on to the next slide, that may be easier for you.
Okay, it's my phone. Thank you, Ian. It's my phone. Not working too well. Thanks. Okay, so Gertrude Stein's famous lecture, Composition as Explanation, remains a wonderfully mind-befuddling, axis-stretching, language-spidering piece of prose. This text says more about linguistic spatiotemporalities through its execution or its articulation in time than any attempt to theorize, rationalize, or explain it. So I'll read this line from Stein. The only thing that is different from one time to another is what is seen, and what is seen depends on how everybody is doing everything. Stein here achieves a prismatic effect through the repetition of function words and seemingly mundane phrases. The concept of everybody doing everything is contingent rather than static. It differs each time and shifts our perception each time. The radically kaleidoscopic nature of Stein's work is due to the conceptual work done by the reader. So what does this mean for my pareidolia doily analogy? If we think about the effects of repetition written through and or into the conventions of syntactical temporal unilinearity in the English language that we see in Stein's work, the element shared with the pareidolia doily analogy is the moment of stuttering new or near comprehension, wherein something uncertain and new is produced. It is this stuttering moment of conceptual creation through the queering of the syntagmatic paradigmatic axes where things dance with life, where things are defamiliarized and perceived anew. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So my pareidolia doily is encircled all around with a patterned wreath of roses. We may take another brief example from Stein to follow the analogy further. Rose is a rose is a rose. Trifold roses subsequently abound throughout Stein's oeuvre. Rose is a rose is a rose is a rose is a rose. If I repeat the phrase ad infinitum, does it mean something different to Stein's original line, pleasingly triangular in its structure? If we substitute rose for another flower, sunflower, corpse flower, Welwitschia mirabilis, does it mean something different again? The trifold structure is open to infinite manipulation, sometimes literalizing flowers' historic and euphemistic relation to genitalia. Kathy Acker's Eurydice gives a nod to Stein. I can see them, roses. I once said a rose is my cunt. Jeanette Winterson tells us in Written on the Body, playfully, wryly, flatly, sometimes a breast is a breast is a breast. Stein is certainly vastly quotable when it comes to syntactical play. Her rose line crops up frequently in discussions of linguistic spatiotemporality due to its playful repetition, but also due to its radical heicity, its roseness. Indeed, Stein said that it was the first time that roses were read in the English language for 100 years. It happened that whilst doing research around this topic, I encountered multiple occurrences of Stein's famous and beautiful line and further figurative deployments of flowers, as well as Acker's Eurydice in the underworld and Winterson's Written on the Body. They were also blooming in Helen Sixou's Circe, or the Self's Opening, in Armen Avanassian and Anke Henig's Metanoia, in Jacques Ehrman's The Death of Literature, in Stephen Muiki's The Fall, in Stéphane Mallarmé's preface to René Gill's Treatise on the Word, and subsequently Maurice Blanchot's The Work of Fire, in Michel Serres' Hermes, in H.D.'s selected poems, and many more. Combined with a wild and overgrown garden in South London, full of sprawling roses screeching, scratching at the panes of my window, the repetition, no, let us call it what it is, the patterning of roses creeping, unfurling, blooming around the physical and psychical space forces me to perceive, create, or employ, depending on where you, the audience member, source the agency of the motif, or even of the roses themselves, this pattern as instrumental to the overall thesis of this paper. The logic of the doily would lead you to think that it is, in fact, a paper about roses. Going any further down this overgrown garden path is probably inadvisable. Neural pathways strewn with roses are perhaps likely to distract more than they elucidate. And yet, what this example serves to demonstrate is the potential repercussions of applying paradigmatic logic to an argument, or Jacobson's poetic function, or my own logic of the doily to an argument. Argumentation to us is so utterly and thoroughly powered by the syntagm, and yet it is through the reorientation of linguistic spatiotemporalities and the consequent imaginative labour that new neural pathways are forged and new concepts are created. Can we go back to slide 4, please? Thank you. Going back to Stein's composition as explanation, we take this title to mean that there is an analogy being drawn between composition and explanation. The word as is the linking word that heralds the simile or comparison or substitution. It is not composition equals explanation, but somewhere in between. This in turn heralds the shift itself from explanation, which would be generally understood as syntagmatic, to composition, which is not strictly paradigmatic, but suggests a more spatialized type of arrangement. So I'm suggesting that Stein's entire piece can be encapsulated in this title. It is not quite composition is explanation, but the logic of the as presents this as a possibility hovering within the word. The best way to attempt to express this analogical movement or shift between as and is might be through a speculative attempt at a Steinian sentence. Next slide, please. And the next one, thank you. So, speculative attempt at a Steinian sentence. As is, and as is, and as is as is, because an as can be, as an is, and as, I knew I would get that one mixed up, because an as can be, as an is can do, which is to say, as can do. So all that sentence is attempting to do is to place the movements of as and is side by side to demonstrate that they might be analogically related. And in doing so, there is a suggestion that as may acquire the status of a verb, as can do. As is more ontoepistemologically fluid than is. It permits an understanding of categories as mobile and shifting, resists finality, and ultimately constitutes an opening rather than a closing of terminological boundaries. I want to conclude then to suggest that this logic of the as, a shift within the as, demonstrates the affirmation of queer language, shift language, language indeterminate. It is precisely the equivocation of as drawn from a critique of linguistic linearity in favour of more complex assemblages that allows for one lexical object to operate as shift and differ within itself. In the conclusion to his poetry collection, Rallying, Australian poet Quinn Eads draws inspiration from Stein's text Tender Buttons to write his own version, Tender Bodies. Next slide, please. So Quinn Eads' writing of Tender Bodies includes the subtitle Boy Cunt. Boy Cunt operates according to as rather than is. It is a deliberate yet uneven, almost synecdochic, part for whole, whole boy for cunt part, splicing of conventionally oppositional anatomical terms. Boy cunt expresses and affirms equivocation from within. It does not seek a teleological end, but rather is shift, as shift, it shifts. The text includes some of Stein's original lines in italics, interspersed with Eads' own visceral and heart-wrenching prose. Stein's line, "The difference is spreading," takes on a different meaning in the context of a transitioning body. The inventorial household nature of Stein's text becomes an emotional inventory, an inventory of love. "My boy cunt is a red leaf and we fuck it together," writes Eads. And from the flipping of geometrical and corporeal externalities and internalities bursts forth new angles, new axes, new assemblages. Composition as kaleidoscope. Queer defamiliarization as the splicing of language. Thank you.